All right, so I see 12 on my end, so I'll go ahead and get started to be respectful of time. It's nice to see so many of you and a lot of names that I actually recognize now. So welcome back. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Wajia, one of the CCA board members, welcoming you to our May event on executive compensation. I know you've actually heard from Mike Meyer and Adam Hearn about a year ago, and they're back by popular demand. We're going to be discussing like various different topics under executive compensation. And I know this particular topic has quite a lot of interest. I know we're expecting a large crowd today, and there were also some questions that were kind of brought up in advance. So I know that Mike and Adam, they're with Meridian. They they're going to do their own introduction, so I'm just gonna let them do that. But I'd love to kind of go into just a quick bit on our sponsors. If I could get this slide. Thank you. So for our sponsors, thank you very much. So there's Achievers, Korn Ferry, Syndio Workhuman, and Towers Watson, and of course Meridian, who we have today. I do want to kind of bring up just one additional topic before I give it off to Adam and Mike, and that is our upcoming event, which is the annual summit. It's going to be May 18th, and it's a full schedule for that day. It's in downtown Chicago. The location is pretty accessible for those coming from Union Station or from Ogilvy. So similar to last year, we're going to kind of have a couple different speakers. This time around, we have Lori Whisper from Towers Watson. We've got Dow Scott from one of our researchers from Loyola University. We have Michelle Murray, who is with Living Wage for Us, and then Marta Turba, who is from World at Work. So a great panel there, and we're hoping to also leave time at the end of the day to do some sort of like a knowledge transfer, similar to what we did last year, where you'd have an opportunity to ask any questions at all, and any of the folks in the room or the speakers could chime in and kind of give each other notes on best practices. So I hope that you guys can sign up soon. We're running out of days for that. I know an email went out earlier this week, and then there should probably be another reminder that comes your way next week. All right, so I hope I finally get to see more of you next in 2 weeks. But for today, I will kind of give it back off to Adam and Mike. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the intro, and thank you to everybody for joining us for our discussion on being prepared in an evolving executive compensation environment, which, if you're like us, sounds riveting to you. So Mike and I will do our best to keep things interesting and to hopefully address some issues that you're all facing. And we'll certainly leave time for questions at the end. But let me take a minute before we introduce ourselves more fully and just walk you through the agenda real quick. So like I said, Mike and I'll spend a couple of minutes introducing ourselves and explaining what Meridian Compensation Partners does and how we might interact with you and the companies that you work for. And then we'll dive in pretty quickly into our topic and talk about an effective process when working with the compensation committee. We'll drill into that much deeper. We'll spend some time there before we move on to a couple recent regulatory updates that we think are particularly front of mind for most of our clients, and hopefully you'll see some value there as well. And then we'll wrap up and talk about a few key takeaways. And like I said, we'll answer some questions. We'll do our best if you ask questions during the next 45 minutes or so, which we encourage you to do, so you don't just listen to the two of us for 45 minutes straight. We'll do our best to answer those questions right as you raise them, but otherwise we'll certainly leave time for comments or questions at the end. So if we move on to the introduction, like I started to say, my name is Adam Hearn. I'm a lead consultant with Meridian. I'm actually an attorney by background. So before I got into consulting, I worked in the Chicago office of a global law firm in their executive compensation practice for several years. And then I've been in the executive compensation consulting space for most of the last 10 years or so. And I've been with Meridian for about 5. Mike and I work both together on clients and separately on our own clients. And I'll let Mike speak for himself and his clients, but mine are across a wide variety of industries. So retail, medical, real estate, specialty chemicals, fintech, all sizes, really, anywhere from below $1 billion or even pre-revenue, all the way up to $20 billion in terms of size. Most of the clients that I work with are public companies, but certainly over the last few years, there's been more IPO and SPAC type work for private companies that are looking to go that route. And we really focus on, like I said, a wide variety of industries and sizes and everything compensation related. But let me turn it over to Mike to introduce himself and talk a little more about Meridian.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So like Adam alluded to, at Meridian, each of us kind of have our own set of clients. We work collaboratively with each other, with our associates, but then also kind of have our own unique experiences, which is why, similar to our client setup, you have both Adam and I here today because we offer different perspectives. Even though we work for the same firm, we do the same type of work. Each client offers us some kind of unique experiences and perspectives that we can leverage across our about 100 employees here at Meridian. So me personally, I'm Mike Meyer. I'm also a lead consultant at Meridian here in our Lake Forest, Illinois office. I too have clients across several different industries. I don't necessarily focus on one industry in particular. I do have quite a few technology companies, both from a hardware and a software perspective, some agricultural companies, manufacturers, some professional services type companies. And like Adam, I do work with both small and large companies, private and public companies. So again, you kind of get that array of different perspectives, point of views, different life cycles and maturity within the organization. And so we do get to see these programs, these plans and programs start to evolve over time. And we can kind of be the expert third party voice in the room that says, okay, how what are we seeing in the marketplace in terms of how these plans and programs evolve over time. So when I mention, our clients, what does that mean specifically? So about 90% of our client relationships are with the board of directors, and more specifically, the compensation committee of the board of directors. But that's kind of the end result where we go to present, our findings and discuss some key decisions that have to be made in terms of exec comp. But the day-to-day work that Adam and I do really involves the management team more often than the board of directors. The reason we work so closely with the management team is because management has the best perspective on company strategy, right? Which we definitely want to align the pay programs to the company's ultimate strategy, but also the plan designs and the programs. And ultimately management will be kind of proposing any changes to the plan design that the board will approve. And the board's approval, certainly they rely on us as kind of an expert in the room to discuss market practice and what we see with our other clients. But again, management's perspective on the strategy of the company and the current programs is certainly helpful context in all of this as well. So you'll see when Adam gets into the process of how we work, it's kind of a three-party approach of Meridian, management, and the committee to really get things done most effectively. So that's a little bit about Adam and I, but just in terms of Meridian as a whole, we do focus entirely on executive compensation. And for me personally, I've been doing this just shy of 10 years, and this has been my only career. I've really been focused specifically on executive compensation and related governance practices and director pay. And so you'll see here on this slide, we talk about Meridian in terms of the number of consultants we have. We have about 100 associates spread across the United States, as well as Toronto, Canada. We do have roughly 750 clients that we service. And again, that's large and small, public and private. And what we do when we service these clients is more than just executive pay levels. Certainly, we do look at base salary, target bonus, long-term incentives in terms of the size of those awards. But we also look at other things related to the program designs, the annual bonus plans, the long-term incentive plans, what vehicles are being granted, what metrics are being used, and then also related governance features, such as stock ownership guidelines, some of these risk mitigating policies that we have in place for executives. So while we do keep our focus pretty high level to the executive team and CEO direct reports specifically. A lot of these decisions that are being made do flow down and impact the rest of the organization. So these decisions are made at a very high level in terms of the participants in the plans, but they do kind of set the stage for the comp programs throughout the company. So that's kind of Meridian and Adam and I in a nutshell. I'll kind of pass it back to Adam here to get into the bulk of our material here today.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I think you touched on a lot of what the first slide is going to be about, but I just wanted to take a second and sort of zoom out. And the reason that Mike and I thought that this would be a useful topic to spend our time on today is because there's only so much that you, if you're in Total Rewards, and it's a global you talking to the audience, but there's only so much that you can control. There's only so much impact that we can control as an independent compensation consultant. So one of the things that we do have control over, or at least more control over sometimes, can be the process. And so what can we help you to think through? How can we be a valuable resource as you think through what makes an effective process when you're working through a committee calendar or a committee meeting with the compensation committee? So we wanted to spend a little time talking about process. So Mike, if you would go to the next page, this is sort of the triangle approach that Mike was alluding to. And like Mike said, we are usually engaged by the compensation committee of the board of directors. So we do work for them. They're our boss, so to speak. But the way we work best is, like Mike said, when we're working collaboratively with management. So from our perspective, the most effective process begins with sort of this philosophically collaborative approach. And so even though that, those are all sort of high level words that sound good, what does that actually mean? From our perspective, each of the three prongs of this triangle has a role. And so we want to spend a minute talking about how we think about effective roles for management, for the compensation committee, and for Meridian as an independent advisor. So for management, like Mike said, they're the ones who are driving changes to programs, they're driving strategic perspective shifts, they're developing strategy, and they're the ones who are communicating those specific ideas. Meridian is not a business strategy expert. We're there to be a resource, and we can certainly give our insights and our opinions, but ultimately the strategy is driven by management. As we're putting together deliverables, as we're helping flesh out ideas, again, we can be a resource, but those ideas are typically coming from management. The compensation committee's responsibility, or their role, is really to oversee, and they provide governance. They're giving their blessing to the pay programs and the strategic decisions that are made. They're reviewing pay for the CEO and ultimately approving for other Section 16 officers. And the decisions that they make are informed by both Meridian and management's suggestions, but ultimately that's the committee's role, is to approve. But then as an independent consultant, our role is really to kind of bridge the gap. Obviously, management and the compensation committee are not always on the same page, even though they're well aligned. And we look at our role as to sort of bridge that gap that can exist between management and the compensation committee. We're helping management coordinate material development. We're helping with preparation for meetings. If we're doing our jobs well, and hopefully everybody is doing their job well, we sort of go by a mantra of no surprises in the boardroom, and hopefully that's evident as you go through this process of communicating openly and efficiently and preparing meeting materials ahead of time, and having this ongoing dialogue between all three of these groups. Hopefully that gets to an outcome that's efficient and successful for everybody.
Yeah. Adam, could I just drill down a little bit into the management bucket, just so we're all on the same page of what management means? So typically when we're having these interactions with management to kind of get an idea of, what's upcoming at the next meeting cycle, what do the plans and programs look like, give us a little bit of the history and the strategy of the company. The people we're having these conversations with, on the outset, our certainly CEO and CFO will often do kind of like executive interviews with those individuals who have kind of the best grasp of the strategy of the company. But more of the day-to-day work in terms of the meeting preparation and the materials that we're presenting at the upcoming meeting is with the HR team that we're collaborating with specifically. So the head of HR certainly, but then the day-to-day is typically the VP of Total Rewards and kind of the exec comp manager would be typically involved in these types of prep conversations. The reason being is because we want, not only do we need an idea of what the current programs look like, but we also need help kind of gathering data to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of current pay levels, current program designs, market data. Sometimes the client has access to certain subscriptions that Meridian may not have access to. So it's the head of HR, it's the VP of Total Rewards, and it's the exec comp manager that we typically work with most often to make sure that we have all the data and the information that we need. So those are the specific parties that we're speaking to in terms of management.
Great points. Thanks, Mike. And so then I think the next sort of logical question in creating an efficient and effective process is, okay, it's fine to talk about the roles and the role that everybody plays. How does that actually translate into the committee meeting cycle? What does that actually look like? So Mike, if you'd go to the next slide, please. What we put together here is just sort of an annual committee cycle. It's hypothetical, so no black or white, right or wrong answers, and this assumes a calendar year-end company. So obviously, if your company is different, this can be adjusted accordingly. Also, I think it's important to recognize that the more meetings you have in a particular year does not necessarily equate to better. We're not suggesting that if you have 8 meetings, because 4 is good, 8 is better. There's a nice balance. There's sort of a middle of the fairway that we find to be 4 to 6 meetings. So for purposes of this slide, we put 5 meetings together, but it's very company specific, it's very client specific, and it's very year specific. So if there are unexpected items that require their own meeting, you want to stay flexible enough to be able to incorporate that into your annual meeting cadence. But ideally, what you're looking for is enough meetings to sufficiently address the work that the comp committee needs to undertake each year. So for this, let's assume, like I said, it's a calendar year end, and we're assuming 5 meetings. Let's sort of start in the lower right, sort of this May to August timeframe. Again, it doesn't have to be May and August; it could be April and September. But usually, there's a couple meetings around then. And the reason I'm starting here, that's where we are in the calendar right now, obviously. So hopefully, things have died down a little bit. If you're a calendar year-end company, you've likely filed your proxy statement for the year already. Obviously, the prior year incentive payouts have all been finalized, and those have been paid. The annual and long-term design features of your program for this year have already been finalized, and your annual shareholder meeting is likely coming up soon if that hasn't happened yet. So what sort of activities are happening right now? Say on pay is an issue that's front and center for many companies right around the time of their annual shareholder meeting. What that means is that ISS and Glass Lewis may be issuing their reports summarizing their recommendations on shareholder proposals. This is the time in the year where we find it's helpful because things are a little bit slower to be talking in terms of your company's compensation philosophy. Do you want to target median pay, for example? Is that something that you explicitly state in your proxy? Is that something that have you not had a formal pay philosophy before? This is the time that we're often visiting for the first time or revisiting pay philosophy. The other big project that's usually on our client's typical agenda for this May to August timeframe is to review the peer group that's used mostly for benchmarking pay levels. But like Mike alluded to earlier, we're also using that peer group, not just for benchmarking executive pay, but also outside director pay for many of our clients and short and long-term incentive design structure. So we're doing that review of the peer group in the May to August timeframe. And the reason we do that is you sort of continue clockwise in the circle. When you're going to have a meeting in the fall, sometime around October, we're using the peer group that was finalized already for the year in order to do our key benchmarking deliverables. So we're benchmarking usually executive pay levels and outside director pay levels. And I guess I should point out the reason that we're reviewing the peer group annually, if we're looking at a group of somewhere around 15 to 25 companies, which is what most of our clients have in their benchmarking peer groups, that's the right size to sort of smooth out some of the year-over-year changes that have to take place in the peer group. If there are a couple companies that got acquired or declared bankruptcy or are no longer, for one reason or another, good peers, continue to be viable peers, there's going to be some year-over-year change to that group. So that if we do that work in August, or between May and August, then when fall comes around, you're able to use that new peer group to do these benchmarking activities.
Yeah. Adam, could I just speak real conceptually quick to peer groups and benchmarking?
Yeah.
Realize that most people on the phone here are probably familiar with those concepts, but the ultimate goal, once we reach December in this chart, is when we're setting pay for 2024, we want to make sure that those pay levels are competitive with the marketplace. And that could mean something very different for the CEO, for the CFO, for the CHRO. So our goal during this part of the year is to create a group of companies that we feel we not only compete with for business, but also for talent, right? So we'll often ask the management team, who have you lost talent to in the past? And who have you recruited talent from in the past? So when we say peer group, 20 to 25 companies that are most similar to us in terms of operations, that are similar size to us. If you look at the metric that's most correlated with the pay levels of executives, it's revenue size. So as you grow as a company, pay levels start to get bigger to address the complexity of the company. So who are similar in size, which companies are similar in business operations, and which companies do we compete with for talent? And those are the companies that often make up the peer group that we then use in October to do a competitive analysis that we call benchmarking. So we're looking at the current executive pay levels of your company, and we're comparing it to the executive pay levels of that peer group and potentially some broader survey market data to say, okay, for a company of our facts and circumstances, are we paying our executives competitively? So that just level setting on what a peer group is and what the benchmarking analysis is, just to show you that this is really kind of a 6-month process leading up to December and January and February when we're really setting those pay levels for the upcoming year.
Great color. Thanks, Mike. And just to sort of round out the slide, also in December, typical activities that we're seeing on the agenda for those meetings, that's when committees are approving the short and long-term incentive design for the next year. They're also doing some other miscellaneous items that they've got to do, like self-evaluation of themselves as a committee, et cetera. Then when you get to the March meeting, that's when we're seeing the prior year business results that are approved for purposes of calculating the short and long-term incentive payouts. We're seeing those the short and long-term performance goals for what will be 24 are approved typically in that March meeting after the business results are understood. That's also, as many of you are aware, because you just finished going through the process, that's when the CD&A within the proxy statement is typically drafted and reviewed. So again, no magic there, pretty high level, but this is an example of how the annual committee meeting cadence can look. But we're talking about efficient process, and that can only happen smoothly if the committee can successfully get through each of these tasks at each of these meetings. So the next question is, how do we ensure that the actual committee meeting in March or in May, in August, in October, that each one of these goes smoothly? And so then we sort of lead into the next slide, if you would, Mike. And from our perspective, the way that we can help ensure that the actual committee meeting, each of the 5 meetings or however many you have, is as successful and efficient as possible is by recognizing that each one of those meetings actually has its own meeting cycle. And so each of the steps on this circle could really be its own slide. We could probably talk about any one of these for an hour. but obviously we don't have that kind of time. So the big high level takeaway for all of this, if I could summarize it in one word, is time. That the best piece of advice that at least I would give, and Mike might have different advice, but that I could give to everyone is to try to build in as much time as possible for each one of these meetings. I've got plenty of clients who invariably, despite our suggestions, feel like they are scrambling to even put a meeting agenda together a couple weeks before the meeting, let alone do all of the things that are on this slide. If you start at the top, each committee meeting from our perspective starts with drafting an agenda. And if that process doesn't happen until too close to the meeting, the rest of these things get squeezed. After you've got an agenda that's going to lay out what the topics are for discussion and whether it's going to be something that's covered by management or Meridian or someone else, you have to have that agenda first before you know who's going to be developing the materials. So as you move sort of clockwise through this progression of what makes for an effective committee meeting, after you've got the agenda, then it makes sense to develop the materials. And Meridian can be as involved as our clients like. We can develop all of the materials for a given meeting. Usually we're developing the materials that we're presenting on, and we'll talk about some examples from a regulatory standpoint in a couple of minutes. But like Mike was talking about, if we're working on benchmarking materials or peer group materials, we'll often prepare those materials and ultimately present them at the committee meeting. But as we go through this sort of iterative process to prep for the meeting, we'll develop draft materials and we'll show those to different people within management first. And so again, as you're continuing through this circle, ultimately we want management to be in full agreement with the materials that we put together. And so we need enough time in the process after we have the agenda to iterate on materials and ultimately make sure that management and Meridian are on the same page with the materials before we then show them to the committee chair and get buy-in from the committee chair. And invariably there are edits or suggestions. Peer group, for example, we might put together what we think is a perfectly reasonable suggestion for a peer group. Management might be in agreement. And then the committee chair says, what about this company? Or why did you choose that company? We have to have enough time to sort of go back to the drawing board a little bit and get the materials ready so that, as again, you continue through this circle, there's enough time for materials to be posted to the rest of the committee. And then you get to the actual committee meeting. And hopefully we've done enough of the work leading up to that meeting that there aren't any surprises in the room. And again, using peer group as an example, if we have a suggestion, management gives feedback, the chair of the committee buys in, hopefully that while this isn't a rubber stamp, it's a relatively short and sweet discussion. And there's no real surprises or real strong debate that wasn't anticipated. But then the critical part that I think many companies leave out, you finally get to the meeting and you can take a deep breath because you've gotten through it. For many companies, that's the end of the process. And a critical part is sort of this debriefing that we like to have afterwards, and to talk about anything that did come up that was unexpected, what the follow-up items are. Frequently, board members or committee members will want to see additional or supplemental information afterwards, and understanding who's going to generate those materials, how they're going to be circulated, et cetera, is a critical part of the process. Seeing a draft then of the meeting minutes before they're finalized is important. We've got many clients who don't draft the minutes and circulate them until right before the next meeting, at which point 2 months has gone by, and that's a very difficult thing to remember, as opposed to while it's fresh, trying to circulate a draft of the minutes, hopefully soon after the meeting, and getting time on the calendar right then to discuss the agenda for the next meeting. From our perspective, I know I've talked a little bit here, but from our perspective, this is one of the things that we can control and help put in place a process that builds in enough time to develop these materials thoughtfully and carefully, and make sure that we have enough points of contact along the way in between meetings that this really helps keep the trains on the track. Mike, any thoughts on this slide?
No, I think so. I do have a couple thoughts and a couple anecdotes that I'd like to share, but I think it fits better with the next slide, which I think is a super important slide. I'll let Adam speak to it. But how does all this apply to you and to everyone on the phone? And I think there's some opportunity here for Adam and I to share some stories and some goods and bads that we've seen at other clients.
Yeah. So what we wanted to talk about, at least for a few minutes here, was how can you all add value to the process? Like we talked about briefly so far, you've got a board of directors, you've got a compensation committee, you've got a committee chair who's got strong opinions in many cases. How much can any of us actually impact the process? But we think that there are ways that you can add as much value as possible, and efficiency is sort of the umbrella theme that we were trying to stick to. From our perspective, the reason that we put those last couple slides together, if you've got a strong calendar and everybody is on the same page with what the meeting cadence looks like, you should be able to predict what projects are going to be happening in connection with what meeting. If you have a strong 5-meeting annual calendar, for example, you should be able to predict the peer group is going to be happening in the late spring or early summer, and benchmarking pay levels is going to be happening in the fall. Those shouldn't be surprises. Similarly, if you have a strong process for each meeting, from developing the agenda through developing materials, through the meeting, and then debriefing, if you've got all of that built in, enough time for all of that built in, both before and after a meeting, you really should be able to make sure that everything is ready at each step of the process and everybody stays accountable to each other. So what can you do? You can be proactive, and you can, to the extent that that fits with your corporate culture, take initiative and try to be ready for what's coming a meeting in advance. And like we say here, you can be fluent in your company's compensation structure. What do we mean by that? Every company has their own unique set of plan documents, programs, both for executives and throughout the organization. We have clients where people aren't used to finding the information in a timely manner. It will commonly happen that me or Mike asks one of our clients, all right, could you just send us the award agreements so that we could help with these calculations? And it's a deer in headlights sort of look. You can be proactive and recognize that certain pieces of information are necessary at every step of this process. So if you know where your documents are kept and you've got sort of an ongoing inventory of where everything is, when you do get these inevitable questions, whether they're from Meridian or from a board member, you've got them at your fingertips because you're as organized and aware of your organization's plans and programs as you can be. So with that kind of basic understanding of your plans and programs, the annual calendar, we think that really sort of positions you for success to add value whenever a question does come your way.
Yeah, Adam, this is where I thought I could share a couple examples that really kind of sparked in my mind as you were presenting about process. And it's funny, this is the same client, and it's 2 individuals at the same client that I think do a really good job in terms of process, and then also just being curious and taking initiative. So the first person I'll mention is actually the VP of Total Rewards at this particular client. And this individual is so organized in terms of making sure that we're planning for the next meeting, that she always says that I'll give you 1 day after the meeting is done where I won't contact you. So if the meeting is today on May 3rd, she wouldn't contact me on May 4th, but May 5th, I will have an email that morning from this individual saying, okay, let's start prepping for the next meeting. Here's what we did last year. What additional agenda items do we need to add from your perspective? Or what did the committee suggest we put on the agenda for next meeting? So talk about process, right? Like this person is so honed in that they know if we don't start planning 2 days after the previous meeting ended, we won't have enough time to be prepared for the upcoming meeting. And so to that perspective, where you fit into this role is know when the meetings are, right? Have the calendar available, know what's upcoming, because as soon as one meeting ends, we start planning for the next meeting. So that was kind of the VP of Total Rewards at this client. This client also had kind of an exec comp analyst that I interacted with. And since then, he's actually moved on to take a larger role at a different company. But he was always one of the more, intellectually curious individuals that I worked with. I would send something and he would immediately kind of respond on the side. He didn't feel comfortable responding to the whole group, but he's like, hey, just curious, what does this mean? Like, can you explain to me more what a Monte Carlo simulation is? And I was always happy to do it, but that's kind of my area of expertise. So happy to kind of respond, give some context, some color. So this individual then took a larger role at a different company, partially because of his knowledge that he was able to build in his current role, and then called me up and said, hey, can you help at this other client? Because I know you gave great advice at the previous client. And so it's that type of relationship that you can start to build with your advisors, where both of us start to help each other out in terms of educational processes and also just like Adam alluded to, process development and making sure that you're doing the best part you can to help out the whole system. So same client, two different individuals, and both great employees in my experience.
Mike, before you move on, I'll give one sort of opposite example of somebody that could probably have been a little bit more engaged and taken a little bit more initiative. One of the projects that we do annually for most of our clients is a benchmarking analysis. So we're looking at executive pay levels. And one of the things that we need to make sure of is that we know the most current compensation for each of the executives at the company that we're benchmarking. So it obviously doesn't impact the data that we're getting from proxies for peer companies, but in terms of making sure that we understand how each executive is positioned relative to median, we need to know what they're making right now. So where do we get that information? Well, we could certainly look at the most recent proxy from our client. However, there are usually much more current numbers that we can get. Maybe there's promotions or mid-year changes to comp or an additional bonus or anything like that that we might not be aware of in real time. So one of the things that we always do just from a quality perspective is check with whether it's the head of total rewards or someone else within the organization. Hey, do you mind just letting us know if we've got the correct current compensation? And this is a question that happens with every client every single year for these benchmarking projects. After you've done it a couple of times, you might think, oh, I know I'm going to have to give this information. That's part of the process. But this one person in particular that I'm thinking of, every time I would ask for it, it was always having to track them down multiple times, having to ask multiple times, chase down this information. It was always a scramble, like it was the first time we were asking for something like that, but it's a very routine thing. So like we've been saying, to the extent that you can sort of anticipate and develop an understanding and your own internal process, that makes everything much more efficient. So
great. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next topic, which we can hit fairly quickly. But now that we spoke to our career conceptually and kind of how we feel everyone on the phone can add value to that process, we thought it would be helpful to also add a couple of current trends and topics that we're seeing with the vast majority of our clients, to be honest, specifically public company clients. So I'll kick this off. This is all related to recent regulation from the SEC. And this has been an ongoing process dating back to the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. But as a result of that crisis, there was a piece of legislation put in place called the Dodd-Frank Act. And Dodd-Frank, the law included a specific section on executive compensation. And there were 6, I wanted to take a step back. The ones highlighted in green are certainly the ones we're seeing and dealing with the most now currently. But just holistically, I wanted to show you that there were 6 clauses related to executive compensation that have been implemented over time since this law was passed in 2010. The first couple were kind of implemented pretty immediately, and you're familiar with specifically Say on Pay. That's a proposal that ends up in your proxy statement. It's non-binding, but the shareholders do get to vote on how they feel about the executive compensation programs at the company based on public disclosure. And so this is one that's garnered quite a bit of attention, and one that was implemented pretty immediately after the passing of Dodd-Frank. The other one that passed pretty immediately was the independence of the compensation committee. So each of the members of the committee that we work with, the compensation committee, has to be an outside independent voice in the room. You can't have this committee made up of management. It's got to be independent directors. So Say on Pay committee independence were passed pretty immediately. Over the course of my career, I've seen the CEO pay ratio and the hedging rule go into play. And again, each of these comes, once the rules get passed, the first year they get passed, there is a ton of discussion about the impact, how shareholders are going to react, how we go about calculating some of these numbers internally. So it's certainly a bit of a scramble the first year that they were passed. So the CEO pay ratio, for example, is a ratio of how much the CEO is paid versus the median employee of the company. And when this was first implemented, this is brand new, right? So nobody's ever collected this data. And so the first thing we had to help our clients with is, how do we define pay, right, for the CEO versus the median employee? How do we go about collecting this pay data? How do we think, because of the facts and circumstances, maybe our CEO is significantly above the median employee. How are people going to react? What's an appropriate ratio versus an inappropriate ratio? So these are kind of all the questions that went along with the pay ratio. Ultimately, we found that there wasn't a lot of reaction from shareholders and that it was kind of more of an informational item going forward. But again, first year, lots of opportunity, both from a consulting standpoint and from an internal standpoint, to really kind of dig deep into the pay levels. In this case, pay levels for the CEO and median employee. The hedging policy came next, and that was really just kind of that companies had to disclose a policy related to hedging of company stock. So again, this is something that if you see specifically an executive hedging their bet against their company stock, that's typically not a good signal to the marketplace. So many companies have an anti-hedging policy in place, and this kind of codified that to make sure that the executives are not hedging against the growth of their company stock that they hold. So that's kind of the context of 4 of these 6 rules from Dodd-Frank that were put into place in the past 5 to 10 years here. The 2 most recent that we're seeing and that's kind of consumed the lives of both consultants and internal exec comp management teams at our clients is the last 2. The first is kind of in the rearview mirror for the most part. Again, I'll give you some information on this disclosure and what we're seeing preliminarily. And then the second that's kind of upcoming. So I'll start with the pay versus performance. I'll jump ahead to the next slide to kind of show you what this disclosure ultimately looked like. This is a case of, the SEC took a rule that was originally about a paragraph or 2 long, very conceptual in nature. It talked about wanting to show how, compensation actually paid at the end of a cycle. Obviously there would have been stock gains for equity compensation. The bonus payout may not have been at target. It may have been at something different. Performance plans may have paid out differently than what we were projecting. And so the idea behind this disclosure is simply to show how the pay was actually earned versus how the pay was reported upon grant. The SEC turned this into a couple hundred pages of legislation and rules that we had to follow, that public companies had to follow. And this is really what we've been dealing with clients over the past 6 months, and that many of you are probably familiar with. I won't get into much of the nitty-gritty details of this disclosure, but I will kind of tell you how I think this is an opportunity for most of us on the phone. Because this table here that looks pretty innocent takes a lot of collaboration amongst consultants, other kind of external third-party data providers, internal exec comp and HR teams, internal legal teams. And so that's where I feel the opportunity really arose is, take initiative, learn how these numbers are being calculated, learn who the data providers are for each one of these pieces of data. That could be Meridian, that could be an equity valuation specialist, that could be a pension valuation specialist. Know who the different individuals are, the different parties are, and know how these numbers are calculated, because you can really become an expert. There's several of our clients, and to be quite frank, several of our clients, employees, other Meridian associates that may not had to dig really deep into the details. So if you can become an expert in how these calculations are done, that really kind of sets you apart and can make you an expert in the room when you're presenting on this type of data. So again, this table includes reported pay actually earned, as well as some performance measures that you'll see there on the right side, total shareholder return, net income, and then another company selected metric. So again, a lot of a lot of attention to this disclosure, a lot of time and calculation, invested in creating this disclosure. Most companies have already filed this. Most calendar year-end companies filed this with their most recent proxy. What we saw in terms of those disclosures, just some market data quickly. In terms of total shareholder return, companies have the option to compare against an index of companies or a custom peer group. We did see the majority of companies comparing to an index. It was the easier choice, less footnoting, less custom calculations. So we did see most calculating TSR for an index. We saw earnings measures being what companies most often selected for their metrics. So you'll see TSR and net income were required. The company selected metric was a choice. And so EPS, EBITDA, those were the most common that companies selected as their company metric. You will see that for that company metric, many companies use this as an opportunity to tell their story of pay and performance relationships. Sometimes it's difficult to do that with GAAP reported numbers because of the way those are calculated. Many companies chose to use non-GAAP metrics that they thought helped link their performance to the pay of the executives. These are often the metrics that end up in incentive plans. So that's not surprising that we saw a lot of non-GAAP metrics. So that was kind of in the past, already done. It'll continue to be a required disclosure going forward. There's certainly some opportunity to kind of reassess the methodology for that table in the future. But again, that was kind of the heavy lift that all of us just went through over the past 6 months. The next item that you'll see pop up, and this is maybe a bit more high level. You may not have as much purview into this specific rule and policy, but there's something called a clawback policy. This isn't a new concept. This dates back all the way to Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002. But essentially what a clawback is a recoupment policy. If an executive does something or a company does something that overstates the company's financial, overpays the executives because of these mistakes, it could be as bad as fraud or misconduct by one of the executives, but it could just be a restatement of the financials where the executives got paid more than they would have had the financials been correctly reported, right? And so we want a mechanism to be able to recoup additional compensation that was paid to these executives because of misstated financial statements. So this SEC rule kind of codifies that in a way that is a bit more broad than a lot of companies' existing policies. Existing policies do certainly cover, fraud, criminal activity, but they're usually pretty narrow in the fact that if you do something bad that creates a restatement, we'll specifically go after you, right? This new rule is more broad in the fact that it's any restatement of a financial statement where the executive, both current and former, if they received incentive compensation that was above and beyond what they should have received under the restated financials, we now have the requirement under this new law to go recoup that compensation. One of the questions we received before the webinar today was, what do you mean by incentive compensation? Under this new mandatory clawback rule, how is excessive incentive compensation defined? And the way it's being defined under these rules is essentially any pay that is linked to a performance metric that is subject to restatement. So this would not include base salary, which is a fixed cash dollar amount. This would not include time-based equity vehicles like a stock option or a restricted share, because those in no way are linked to the financial performance of the company. This would relate to bonus payouts. This would relate to performance-based shares. Anything that's related to a GAAP financial metric, anything that's related to a market-based metric surrounding total shareholder return or stock price performance, that's what we're talking about in terms of incentive compensation. Anything that's really linked to reportable performance or stock price performance. So think about in a bonus plan, if you had a completely discretionary bonus plan that was based on individual performance, strategic performance, not linked to any financial metric, that would not be subject to clawback. The only thing subject to clawback would be incentive compensation linked to financial performance and stock price performance. I know we're running short on time here, but just, kind of next steps for this rule. It did get finalized by the SEC in November. However, before it can be implemented, the listing exchanges, so the NASDAQs and the NYSEs of the world, have to propose listing requirements that the companies listed on their exchange must follow. So they both of these major indices have proposed these listing standards. The SEC has a few months to approve the listing standards, which we expect may come as early as June, where they approve these listing standards. And then companies have 60 days from the SEC approval of the listing standards to implement a compliant policy. So we're expecting for many of our clients, they'll have to implement a compliant policy by the end of the summer, is really kind of the timeline for this rule.
The only thing I'd add real quick on the clawbacks, Mike, just to sort of bring it back to some of the ways that we all can add value topic that we talked about. The clawback policy is a perfect example of knowing where to go for important information. A lot of companies do have a clawback policy, and it's a 1 or 2 page policy. It might even be on the investor relations portion of your website, but that's not the only place that clawback provisions can live. Those provisions can also live in an omnibus incentive plan. It can live as a provision in each different award agreement. It can live in an employment agreement or a severance agreement. There's any number of different documents that might have slightly different wording on the clawback policy. So one of the decisions that our clients are facing is, do they implement a brand new Dodd-Frank compliant clawback policy, or do they try to amend the existing policy? And that's a little bit more complicated if you've got all of these different clawback provisions in all of these different documents. But Meridian isn't necessarily in a position where we can pull all of those agreements or documents quickly. We need somebody on the inside to be able to share those with us. So if there are ongoing clawback conversations, making yourselves an indispensable part of the process and knowing where to go for all of that information is a very proactive way to add value.
Great. I'll go ahead and skip ahead to just some of the key takeaways so we can open it up for questions here in the last couple minutes. But as we spoke to earlier, the really key focus of this discussion today was around process. That involves how each of you can add value to the process, meaning understanding your committee calendar, your programs, when the meetings are coming up, asking questions, being proactive, things of that nature. And then just lastly, to kind of wrap up what I discussed over the past 10 or 15 minutes here was just recent trends in the industry and what we're seeing in terms of some of the regulatory environments and how that impacts each of us and how each of us can add value because of these new regulations, both in terms of the pay versus performance disclosure and the mandatory clawback disclosure as those get finalized. Adam, anything else you want to add in terms of key takeaways?
No, I think you covered it really well. And I think hopefully there are people with some questions. So we don't have to hit them over the head with this again. We can move on to the Q&A portion. We have gotten a couple other questions. I know before our time today, we got a question about how frequently we're seeing the VP of Total Rewards interact with the board on compensation issues. And Mike can certainly give his take also, but I would say from my perspective, that's happening frequently. But I would also say it really depends. I would say for my clients where we have the most effective process, the head of Total Rewards is actually interacting with the committee chair frequently. I'm on any number of prep calls where the committee chair is interacting mostly with the head of Total Rewards. That's a very effective process, but that isn't every company's culture. Sometimes it's a different person. Sometimes it's the head of HR. But I think it happens frequently. And like I said, the most effective process is where that person, the head of Total Rewards, is in a position to speak on every issue that's going to be before the committee at each meeting. But
yeah, I've personally seen the VP of Total Rewards kind of be the leader of the presentation to the committee, and so they'll kick off the management related topics and kind of give the presentation. The head of HR, the CEO, will then add the color, right? So they'll have the perspective in terms of the company strategy, but the VP of Total Rewards is actually presenting the documents to the committee. So we see that pretty frequently, that the Total Rewards individual will have pretty heavy involvement with the committee.
Definitely. We got another question here. It looks like, does Meridian provide compensation benchmarks for, oh, it just moved on me. Sorry, 1 second. Comp benchmarks for the CEO and other NEOs, or does management provide that using purchased survey data? Again, my response would be that it depends. Meridian certainly does that work, and we can absolutely review proxies and pull that data ourselves, and that's probably what we do most of the time. However, depending on how many executives are being benchmarked, only the top 5 highest compensated are in the proxy, and so for many of our clients, we have to supplement that with survey data. But we would work closely with you, with each of our clients, to determine what the best source of data is for those projects. So we can be helpful in identifying the data, helping establish the relationship with the survey source, because we work with all of the major survey providers. But Mike, I don't know if you have a different take on.
Yeah, no, typically the committee will want the third-party advisor to kind of offer the market perspective. So we'll, especially for CEO, CFO, we can gather that data from public information. We can make it very specific to your peer group. But as Adam alluded to, there's certain roles, even that report directly to the CEO, that just aren't available in public data. So, very often we'll supplement public data with survey data that the company subscribes to, pays for, provides to Meridian. And that really sets the stage for benchmarking below the executive level. So for example, if we're working with a technology company, they're using the Radford survey, or Meridian's using the Radford survey to benchmark executive pay. Oftentimes, internal exec comp management will also use the Radford survey to start to benchmark the next level down. So I think, at the C-suite level, Meridian is doing the benchmarking, but that kind of sets the stage for how the next level down is going to be benchmarked as well.
Looks like we got one other question here. If comp committee activities include other governance items, like approving certain non-executive pay or long-term incentive activities, do you have any thoughts on how best to streamline those discussions while keeping them outside of the limited meeting cycle?
Yeah, I'll answer this briefly. So that there's certain topics that the committee has purview over. Most of those relate specifically to the executive team. But you're right that, especially like long-term incentives often do go deeper than the executive team. And I'll tell you how that rolls up into the committee most often is very aggregate high-level numbers. So you'll see, yes, that while the committee does approve all of the long-term incentive grants, that'll be listed out kind of in an appendix, and it'll show individual by individual what the level of the long-term incentive grant was. But like many of our presentations to the committee, they want to see it at a high level. So I think from a process standpoint, there's always got to be a summary up front of here's how many individuals are receiving LTI. Here's the aggregate dollar amount of long-term incentives that we're granting. So yes, you should have the details available and at your disposal, but again, it's got to be kind of summarized at a high level for the committee.
I guess the only other comment I would make is just from an efficiency and process perspective, the more times that you can have some of these conversations, the easier it'll be to avoid free-for-all debate at a meeting. So yesterday I was on a call with a CEO and head of Total Rewards talking about strategy for incentive design, planning for what activities we're going to undertake this summer and in the fall, so that when it does get to the committee meeting time, we've all socialized all of these concepts before and there's no surprises. So the more times that you can have these conversations internally before a meeting, the more one-on-ones that can be had, and Meridian has several of those, the better from a process perspective. Last question with 1 minute left. Do your clients request updated Monte Carlo evaluations for relative TSR awards throughout the year? Perfect question for Mike, because the answer is yes.
Yeah, this is my area of expertise. Monte Carlo evaluations, very exciting topic. So required Monte Carlo evaluations occur upon the grant. The only exception to that rule, a couple exceptions. The first is historically, if you had a cash-based relative TSR award, pretty rare. But if you have a cash-based award, the accounting rules state that you have to mark those to market each quarter. And so we would have to update Monte Carlo valuations throughout the 3-year cycle each quarter. If it's a stock-based award based on relative TSR, the accounting rules state that you just have to run those upon grant. The reason you're seeing more kind of updated Monte Carlo valuations recently is because of the pay versus performance disclosure. That the rules for that PVP disclosure stated that upon each year end, you have to update the valuation of those awards using GAAP accounting standards. GAAP accounting standards state that for TSR awards, you have to run a Monte Carlo. And so as of each year end reported in that PVP table, we had to run updated Monte Carlo valuations. And so that's where you saw a lot of these interim valuations being required, which will again be required at the end of this upcoming year for next year's disclosure. But in general, for accounting purposes, Monte Carlo valuations are just required upon the grant.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Hopefully this was beneficial for you. And if you do have questions going forward, hopefully you'll have our contact information and don't hesitate to reach out. We like to talk. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam and Mike. This was great. And thank you everyone for participating. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, you too.
Great, thank you.